Psychology and the study of mental health have been around since the classical era. The scientific understanding that is generally accepted today is fairly new. There have been various significant reform movements over the last 3 centuries. Up until the late 19th century, those who were mentally insane were believed to be possessed by evil spirits. Therefore, the most common treatments seen throughout the Middle Ages were exorcisms. Oftentimes, those who were mentally insane were treated like prisoners, chained up, whipped, naked, and locked behind bars. The conditions of these prison-like treatment hospitals were incredibly unsanitary.
Dorothea Dix was born in 1802 in Maine. After visiting a prison in Massachusetts, Dix was horrified by the treatment of both prisoners and the mentally insane. She saw the current system was unregulated and prone to abuse. Dix presented her findings and plans for mental health asylums in the Bill for the Benefit of the Indigent Insane, which proposed that federal land be set aside for the benefit of the insane. In 1854, Franklin Pierce vetoed it, arguing that state governments, not the federal government, were responsible for sponsoring social welfare programs. Dix then traveled around Europe and conducted investigations of mental health institutions. Dix continued her crusade on the state level for the introduction of asylums. However, shortly after these programs were introduced, these buildings turned into Gothic-style prisons with horrible conditions.
Bethlem Royal Hospital, located in London, England, started to house the mentally insane around 1357. In Bethlem, people paid to jab the mentally insane with pointed sticks. The Kirkbride Plan, named after 19th century psychologist Thomas Story Kirkbride, is a system of mental asylum design. Most of the individual components of the plans had some benefit to the patients. The wings were staggered so each wing received sunlight and fresh air. This was intended for both privacy and comfort for the patients. Kirkbride believed that specially designed buildings could have a curative effect. He described his buildings as a special apparatus for the care of lunacy, whose grounds should be highly improved and tastefully ornamented. The buildings were often large Victorian-era buildings with large amounts of surrounding grounds that often included farmland. However, by 1900, the concept building as cure was almost entirely discredited. Many people believe this had less to do with the actual facts and more to do with the expensive nature of these buildings' upkeep.
Worst insane asylums.
Danvers State Hospital, located in Danvers, Massachusetts, was opened in 1878. It is said that this is where lobotomies originated. It is also rumored that inhumane amounts of electroshock therapy were used to keep patients docile and complacent. In Athens, Lunatic Asylum opened from 1874 to 1993 in Athens, Ohio. A dead patient was found in an unheated room that was locked from the inside in 1978. Her corpse left a stain on the wall that was never able to be removed. Topeka State Hospital in Topeka, Kansas was in operation from 1872 to 1997. The institution heavily used lobotomies and electric shock on their patients. This mental institution was known for castrating people, which was legal in Kansas during much of this period.
Insane asylums in Rockland County.
Rockland Psychiatric Center opened in 1928. It fostered the fairly new idea of therapeutic suburb. The hospital had a working farm, its own power plant, and industrial shops, all run by patients. When it first opened, it had 5,768 beds and 60 patients that were transferred from Manhattan State Hospital, and the population of Rockland Site grew exponentially. In 1937, the hospital began to administer insulin shock therapy, electroshock treatment, and lobotomies. Many of the doctors performing these complicated and dangerous surgeries were actually students. At its peak in 1959, Rockland had more than 9,000 residents, 2,000 of whom were staff members. Since the 1970s, Rockland Psychiatric Center has mostly served as an outpatient hospital. Today, it only houses around 600 patients.
My father didn't cause Letchworth to shut down, but my father was very influential on things that happened at Letchworth. He said, I'm very troubled by what we see here. I've haven't studied this, but I'm seeing a lot of the residents choking to death. They're choking on their food, and it's from a suppression of the gag reflex, similar to people being in a restaurant and having a couple of glasses of wine or something and then choking on their food. He said they used to have the farm up at Letchworth, and these residents would go out there and work all day. They loved it, and it was very gratifying to them, and they would work the farm, but they would be very tired, and they'd come home and they'd sleep well, and they were proud of what they did. And then the state came up with the crazy idea that they can't work in the farm anymore unless you pay them minimum wage. What did the state do? They shut down the farms. And how did they make up for it? They ended up medicating them heavier because they didn't have an outlet. What his position was is, I saw that change. I saw when that ended and they started medicating, we started seeing more and more of them choking to death on their food. And the state ended up adopting his findings on it.
Letchworth Village was opened in 1911. It was built to house and treat mentally disabled people of all ages. At this time, it consisted of 130 buildings and was spread out over 2,362 acres of land. The design of many of the buildings is said to be inspired by Monticello, a famous building that was the center of America's third president, Thomas Jefferson's main plantation. This community was founded on the principle that a picturesque setting allows for stronger recovery and treatment than its high-rise equivalent. The lands surrounding the buildings were incredibly fertile and were used for both recreational and agricultural usages. In February 1950, Hilary Kaprowski tested his polio vaccination at Letchworth. Reports of poor treatment of patients date back to the early 1920s, just 10 years after opening. Under the Letchworth system, patients were separated into 3 mental categories or 3 states of feeble-mindedness: the moron group, the imbecile group, and the idiot group. The idiot group consisted of those who were said to be unable to be trained to be of any benefit to the state. A certain Dr. Little noted in a 1921 report that many of the members of this group were children. Many of these children were able to comprehend learning but were either too young or were not given the opportunity because they were considered different. The patients consistently looked malnourished and underdressed. The staff claimed that this was because the state did not provide them with enough supplies. However, this was not the case. The realities of the living conditions at Letchworth were kept a secret for a long time. Letchworth was officially closed in 1996. To this day, many patients and staff refuse to speak about their experiences at Letchworth. However, many of the few accounts we have recall a laboratory containing many jars filled with the brains of past patients. It is generally said that the building was shut down as New York State decided to move towards more humane psychiatric treatment. Today, the buildings remain untouched and in a state of intense decay.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and its effect on the American psychiatric system.
In 1963, Ken Kesey published One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, depicting the lives of a group of mentally insane people. In 1985, Jack Nicholson starred in a film adaptation of the novel, which changed views towards the American psychiatric system in the 1960s.
Little change never hurt, huh?
Huge state institutions were forced to reduce the number of residents they had and grant their patients more rights. The publication was also a catalyst for antipsychotic drug research.
Dr. Frank Pittman said One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest gave life to a basic distrust of the way in which psychiatry was being used for society's purposes rather than the purposes of the people who had mental illness. The novel had many positive implications on the way in which mental patients were treated and led the way for change.